All right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today's deep dive is all about Vender Duncan, a name you might not recognize right off the bat, but stick with us. You guys requested to hear more about him, and well, let me tell you, he was an American serial killer. Yeah, you heard that right. Active in the 1950s, terrorizing elderly women in San Francisco. We're basing this deep dive entirely on Duncan's Wikipedia article, and let me tell you, it is a wild ride, a truly dark chapter in San Francisco's history. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I gotta ask, what is it about Duncan's story that you find so fascinating?
For me, it's the way his case sort of lays bare the connection between his past, like the troubled past he had, and the sheer brutality of the crimes he committed. And then and then there's this unexpected twist. His conscience actually played a role in his capture.
It's crazy, right? You don't expect a serial killer to have much of a conscience. But anyway, let's start at the beginning. Duncan was born in 1928, small Texas town.
hmm
You wouldn't think, small town Texas would be a breeding ground for a serial killer. But even as a kid, Duncan was prone to violence.
Yeah, and that violence it escalated as he got older. When he was 17, he lost an eye. Tragic, obviously.
Yeah.
That kind of thing could change anyone, for better or worse. But with Duncan, it seemed to just fuel his rage. Just a few years later, he did time for attempted murder. And get this, he stabbed the victim 24 times. I mean, talk about a red flag.
24 times.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
So even before he even gets to San Francisco, we see this clear pattern of aggression.
Oh, absolutely. And it gets worse, sadly.
So he settles in San Francisco with his common-law wife, Helen Green,
Yeah.
tries to make a living as a house painter, but it wasn't enough, turns to burglary to make ends meet, often targeting the elderly, and tragically, and maybe predictably, it sometimes escalated to rape.
Right. And this pattern of preying on the vulnerable is really important, right? Like he's not just picking his victims randomly. Duncan chose them specifically because he saw them as weak. That's a chilling kind of calculated cruelty, you know?
Totally. And that brings us to his first confirmed murder. Marceline Herdlick,
Mm.
82 years old. Duncan spotted her counting money through a window. And that simple act, just her counting her money, that sealed her fate.
Yeah, he took that opportunity, climbed at the fire escape, went into her apartment and murdered her brutally. But it doesn't end there. He then went on to sexually assault her after she was already dead.
Oh, God.
I mean, the level of depravity, it
Yeah.
goes so far beyond just stealing from her. There's something much darker at play here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was this detail about the crime that stuck with me. He dropped a radio on the fire escape, like a careless mistake,
Yeah.
right? But those little things, those seemingly insignificant details that often end up tripping criminals up in the end.
Oh, for sure. I mean, forensic science back then wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is now, but even something like a dropped radio could have been huge, could have placed him at the scene. It just
Yeah.
goes to show, right? Even the smallest piece of evidence can be crucial in an investigation.
So Duncan's reign of terror continued. His next victim, Elizabeth Manning, 75 years old, a retired nurse. Once again, he broke into her apartment, and the violence was just savage. Beat her to death.
This one, this one was particularly heartbreaking, Manning's pastor and her neighbors, they noticed that she wasn't at church. They saw the mail piling up at her door, and they just knew something was wrong. And tragically, they were right.
Awful. And to think, her niece was expecting her to move in with her. Just adds another layer of sadness to the whole story. It reminds us that these victims, they weren't just names in a police report. They were real people with lives and loved ones and futures, and those were all stolen from them.
Absolutely. Manning's niece, Marie Gerlach, she even offered a $100 reward for information. I mean, that says a lot about the desperation, the need for answers that comes after these kinds of horrific crimes. People need justice. They need closure.
Sadly, the violence didn't end there. Duncan's next victim was 68-year-old Ada Romig, and this time the attack took place in a vacant lot. He assaulted her with a brick, beat her brutally. You'd think that would be the end of it, but there's a twist.
Yeah, this attack was especially vicious. I mean, he beat her so badly, dragged her between these two lots and left her there to die. It's a level of cruelty that's hard to wrap your head around. But miraculously, Romig didn't die right away. She clung to life for 6 days, 6 agonizing days.
Wow, can you imagine the strength it must have taken for her to hold on after something so brutal?
It's incredible.
And in those last few days, she was able to give a partial description of her attacker. I mean, it doesn't sound like much, but even a small detail like that could be the key to catching a killer.
Right.
Her survival and her determination to help bring her attacker to justice are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable violence, that will to live, the pursuit of justice, it can prevail.
Unfortunately, though, it wasn't Romig's description or any dropped evidence that led to Duncan's downfall. It was something else entirely, something unexpected, something that revealed a hidden depth to this complex and disturbing case.
Right, and that's where things take a really interesting turn. It's this twist that unveils, the unexpected complexities of the human psyche, even in a mind as twisted as Duncan's. But to explore that, we'll have to delve into the next part of our deep dive. So we left off with Vender Duncan, still out there terrorizing the elderly women of San Francisco. But like we hinted at, there's this twist coming, and it's a twist that reveals something kind of surprising about this case, Duncan's own conscience.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I gotta say, it's hard to imagine, right? A man who could do such horrific things suddenly wrestling with guilt. It doesn't seem to compute. I know, right? But the human mind, it's a complicated thing, even for a hardened criminal like Duncan. And for him, that unexpected turning point came with yet another attack. This time, the victim was 73-year-old Agnes Provost.
This attack was brutal too. Duncan breaks into her apartment, same pattern as before, beats her badly, and tries to rape her. But then something crazy happens, something that stopped him in his tracks.
Provost, she's amazing. She, in this incredible moment of bravery and quick thinking, she tells him, there's a police station nearby. And for some reason, that was it. Duncan was terrified. He just ran, left Provost there, beaten but alive.
Wow, so her words, in that moment of absolute terror, they had impact he could never have predicted. It's like it shows you how powerful words can be even in the darkest of times.
Totally. And, she had a smashed cheekbone, a broken jaw, cuts, bruises all over. But Provost, she still managed to get herself to that nearby police station and report the attack. She was a tough lady.
Incredible. And she gave this really detailed description of Duncan, his race, how old and tall he was, even specific things about his clothes. It's like she knew, on some level, that this information could be what stopped him.
Talk about presence of mind. In that kind of traumatic situation, she still managed to stay sharp, focus on the details, and that, I think, played a huge role in what happened next.
Because not long after, Duncan was arrested. But hold on, it wasn't for the attempted rape of Agnes Provost. They got him for burglary, something he'd gotten away with countless times before.
Exactly. But here's where that guilt we talked about comes in. Duncan, while he's in jail, he contacts Lieutenant Al Melder. He was the lead homicide investigator on those previous murders. Duncan, he wants to confess.
Confess to what exactly? I mean, they didn't even suspect him of the murders at this point, right?
Nope, not at all. But Duncan, it seems like he was overwhelmed with remorse or something. He admits to killing Arceline Herdlick, Elizabeth Manning, and Ada Romig. And he doesn't just give some vague confession. He gives very specific details about each crime.
The kind of details only the killer would know. It's like his conscience finally catches up with him, makes him take responsibility for what he did.
It is, and get this, his wife, Helen Green, she comes forward to back up his confession. She tells the police that on the day Ada Romig was murdered, Duncan came home with bloody clothes, had a cut on his hand too, chilling, right? It just solidified his connection to the crimes.
It really does. So we have this shocking confession, but the question remains, why? Why target these women? Why the horrific violence? Did he ever give a reason?
He did, and it's disturbing. Duncan claimed he was always super drunk during the crimes, said it made him more aggressive, and he confessed that he ended up killing his victims because he couldn't stand it when they started to scream.
Oh, God, that just sends chills down my spine. The way he
Right.
talks about silencing their screams, just awful. But at least with the confession and the evidence, it seemed like justice was finally going to be served, right?
You'd think so, but it wasn't quite that straightforward. See, Duncan, he initially wanted to plead guilty. He even said he'd rather be executed than spend life in prison, but then he changes his plea.
To not guilty. After that detailed confession, what was he thinking? What was his game plan?
He enters a dual plea, not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. And that throws a whole new wrench into things. Was he really insane, or was this just a last-ditch effort to avoid the death penalty?
Wow, yeah, this definitely complicates things. So now the court has to figure out not only if he did it, but also what his state of mind was when he committed the crimes. Huge responsibility for the jury.
You're telling me. In this case, it really brings up this important, often misunderstood part of the justice system. Legal sanity versus medical insanity. You see, someone can be diagnosed with a mental illness and still be found legally sane to stand trial.
So, meaning if I understand it right, they're capable of understanding the charges against them, right? And they can participate in their own defense. It's not just about whether they have a mental illness, but whether that illness stops them from understanding the legal stuff. But in Duncan's case, did the jury buy the insanity plea?
Well, that's where we get into the final chapter of this whole chilling story. The trial and what came after. It tells us even more about how the legal system works and that big question of what truly is justice.
Okay, so we're back, and this deep dive into Vender Duncan, well, it just keeps getting more and more complicated. We've got this confession, these awful details about the crimes, even his wife backing up his story. But then, bam, the insanity plea. It kind of throws everything we thought we knew out the window.
It does, doesn't it? It's a classic legal move for sure, but in Duncan's case, it really makes you think. Was he really mentally ill, or was this plea just, him trying to save his own neck? And even if he was mentally ill, does that make what he did any less horrific?
Yeah, those are some tough questions. And in the end, it was up to the court to decide. So what happened? Did the insanity defense work?
Well, the trial started on April 15th, 1958. And the prosecution, they focused specifically on the murders of Marceline Herdlick and Elizabeth Manning, the ones from 1955. Remember, even though Duncan had said he wanted to plead guilty at first, he ended up sticking with that dual plea. Not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity.
So the jury had to decide not only if he was guilty, but also what his mental state was like when he committed the crimes. Must have been a lot of pressure for them.
Oh, absolutely. And like we talked about before, this case really highlights the difference between being legally sane and being medically insane. You can have a mental illness and still be considered legally sane enough to stand trial.
Which means, basically, that they understand the charges against them, right?
Yeah.
And they can participate in their own defense. It's not about whether or not they're mentally ill. It's about whether that illness prevents them from understanding what's going on in court. So, in Duncan's case, did the jury believe the insanity plea?
They did not. After 11 days of deliberating, they came back with a guilty verdict on all charges.
Wow. And with that verdict came the sentence. Death. I mean, the brutality of his crimes, the confession, his wife's statement, it all sealed his fate.
It did. But it's important to remember that even with a guilty verdict and a death sentence, the legal process, it doesn't just end there. There were still appeals, right?
Oh, right. This is a death sentence, the ultimate punishment. Duncan's lawyers, they must have fought hard, right? Tried to get the sentence reduced.
They did. They filed appeals, went to the Supreme Court of California, even appealed directly to Governor Pat Brown for clemency, hoping to get his sentence changed to life in prison.
So there was still hope. A chance his life could be spared.
There was, but both the Supreme Court and Governor Brown, they refused to overturn the sentence. So it was upheld, and the execution date was set.
And on May 29, 1959, Vender Duncan was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. Grim end to a story full of violence and tragedy, but it's the story that makes you think,
It does. And even though some people might feel like justice was served, it doesn't take away the pain and suffering that his victims and their families went through. Those scars, they run deep. They last long after the trial is over, long after the execution.
That's so true. This whole case, it shows us how much darkness there can be in the human heart. But it also shows us how strong the human spirit can be, especially someone like Agnes Provost. Faced unimaginable terror and still fought back.
Amazing woman. And for us, the people hearing this story, it leaves us with some really complex questions to grapple with. I mean, does the fact that Duncan confessed in the end, that he seemed to be eaten up by guilt, does that change how we see his crimes? Does it make the violence any less real? Or is the brutality of what he did, is that the most important part of his story, no matter how sorry he might have felt later on?
Yeah, those are hard questions, and I don't know if there are any easy answers. I think it comes down to how complicated human beings are. The gray areas of morality, our constant struggle to figure out why people do these kinds of things.
Exactly. And that conversation, it doesn't end just because the show's over. There are no easy answers. But I think by having these conversations, by exploring the darkest parts of human nature, maybe, just maybe, we understand ourselves and the world a little bit better.
Well said. And to you, our listener, thank you for being here for this deep dive into Vender Duncan. It's a case that really stays with you, makes you think. It challenges us to look at the justice system, at the nature of good and evil in new ways. We hope this deep dive has given you a different perspective, left you with more questions than answers. And as always, stay curious, keep those minds sharp,